Support for the Blueprint podcast comes from the SANS Institute. Since the debut of SEC 450, we've always had students interested in a matching course covering the management and leadership aspects of running a SOC. If you like the topics on this podcast and would like to learn more about Blue Team leadership and management, check out the new Management 551, Building and Leading Security Operations Centers. This new course is designed for security team leaders looking to build, grow, and operate a security operations center with peak efficiency, and it's a hands-on technical leadership course that takes you through everything from scoping threat groups to use case creation and organization, threat hunting planning, SOC maturity and detection assessment, and much, much more. Check out the course syllabus, labs, and a free demo at sansurl.com/551, and I hope to see you in class.
This is the Blueprint Podcast, bringing you the latest in cyber defense and security operations from top Blue Team leaders. Blueprint is brought to you by the SANS Institute and is hosted by SANS certified instructor John Hubbard. And now, here's your host, John Hubbard.
If you're running a security operations team, there are a lot of ways that you can choose to check yourself. You may have penetration tests, you may do atomic testing, and you may also do adversary emulation. In this episode, we have Jamie Williams from MITRE, who is an expert in adversary emulation, and we talk about what adversary emulation is, why you would want to do it, how MITRE has already set you up for success running adversary emulation tests, and how you can run your own tests. All that and more today on the Blueprint Podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Blueprint Podcast. Today on the show, we have Jamie Williams, a member of the MITRE ATT&CK team and expert in adversary emulation. Welcome to the podcast, Jamie.
Thanks for having me, John.
So, as I understand, one of your specialties with MITRE is working on adversary emulation. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast today is adversary emulation is one of those topics I think a lot of people might think is maybe out of their reach, or it's too complex, or it's too expensive, or maybe they don't have the info to do it. But I would argue that although it might be some of those things, it's also maybe one of the most important things you can do, because it's the most like realistic simulation of attackers, right? And that's really what we're here to do, is like stop real world attackers, right? So what I'm hoping to do today through our conversation is kind of give listeners an idea of what adversary emulation is, how it works, and how it can make their team better. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds beautiful. Love it.
Perfect. So let's dive in then. Adversary emulation. Could you give the listeners a quick idea of what it is, kind of in comparison to some of the other testing methods out there, and like just what is it as a topic?
Okay. So we have a full ecosystem of like offensive assessments. We've all heard terms like, pen testing, vulnerability analysis, red teaming. Adversary emulation is just another flavor of that. This is just, a good way for us to leverage all the, the CTI and the intelligence we have about adversaries and injecting that into our assessment process. So, long story short, rather than a red teaming getting on keyboard and just doing what they do, or pen testers doing what they do and kind of, swaying to their preferences and whatever they see, we kind of try to shape those assessments based on intelligence, saying, instead of just doing what, Steve or Amy or, Tina, whatever their like preferences are, hey, let's try to look like, a particular adversary. Let's try to use the behaviors that we've seen adversaries actually use and see how, not necessarily see like, can you get the top of the hill? Can you get domain admin and kind of take over the environment? But let's see what happens when these behaviors are injected into the environment, more to kind of, line up with what defenders actually need from those assessments. Let's see how the mitigations work. Let's see how detections work. Let's see how quick people are to respond to these alerts, and kind of get a closer real feel to what a real breach from a real adversary would look like.
You mentioned it's another flavor of testing. One of the ways I like to break down testing is kind of look at it in different kind of axes, right? Is it announced? Is it unannounced? Is it something with a specific set of goals in mind? Is it let's figure out what we can do here? Are we trying to, use certain tactics and techniques? How would you compare adversary emulation to some of those other, pen testing or maybe purple teaming, kind of on some of those sort of variables? And why is it another form of testing that's needed?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. So, there's various different ways you could do this. You could do this unannounced. You could do this announced, just like any other assessment. I think where adversary emulation kind of, separates itself from these other forms of assessment is kind of the output and kind of the documentation. From adversary emulation, you're very much going to have, everything tailored towards a TTP-based output. So not necessarily saying, did the red team succeed, where they failed, what technologies failed, and point to particular like victims, but more like, because of the shape of the plan, like you go into it with an intelligence, focus, the output is going to have that same intelligent focus, or like, hey, we executed, this type of initial access, this type of discovery, this type of execution, working your way through that attack chain. and then documenting kind of along that same way, like this worked, this didn't, this worked, this didn't, and kind of having that granular, technique, by technique level of like documentation, which I think a lot of defenders kind of think in that spin. So it's kind of like a really quick way to, another buzzword here, but get closer to purple teaming, where you have your red team and your blue team kind of talking the same language and saying, this is exactly what we did. How did you guys detect that? And then kind of working back and forth and seeing, how to actually improve the environment.
You mentioned the TTP-based output. Is that something that is going to be accessible to most teams? Because I know when I think like adversary emulation, one of the things that comes to mind is like there's a lot of attackers out there with a lot of custom tools and stuff like that. How do I, the blue teamer, let alone not even a red teamer, right? How do I emulate what an attacker is going to actually be doing? Is that going to be a roadblock for that?
So if only we had this like thing that could serve as like a common language between like different people, right? Like that would be such a crazy idea. But yeah, that's to exactly your point. Something like the attack framework is going to be perfect for this. Like I actually am one of the leads on attack, so I'm going to push that to the sun goes down. But attack really enables us to build that scorecard, build that kind of shared perspective where we can point to the same thing on a matrix and say the red team is, whatever jargon, whatever tools they're using, it all has these like, super fancy names, all the potatoes and all the cats and stuff. They can point to something and say, we are executing this technique. And a blue teamer can look at that and say, okay, well, we have Sigma rules, we have Splunk rules, we have analytics, we have this like technology stack that is particularly, geared towards that technique. And they can actually meet in the middle and have like an intelligent conversation versus just slinging jargon back and forth with each other. And then, 40-page papers that neither of them can read from each other. I think, attack really brings us together and helps us like, not just red team and blue teamers, but also like talking back to your, your engineers, your procurement, your upwards to your CEOs. Like, I don't know how many CISOs are going to read those 40-page reports versus like, this pretty like one slide document that, a matrix on it that has like, different colors and you can quickly communicate all that information. So, that's kind of one of the premises of attack is we're trying to not just make a model, but make an operational model that, security practitioners can actually use. So hopefully that's kind of hitting that point there.
Yeah. And I think it absolutely is kind of hitting those goals, and that there's, tons of people all over the world picking up attack as a way of measuring their SOC. I know every time when I teach, I always ask as a poll to the class, like how many people have adopted MITRE ATT&CK as a way of ranking what they're doing and what they can detect. And I usually get a majority of people saying yes. It's a little bit different in various parts of the world, but especially in the US, there's like heavy penetration of that framework, and it's done a lot of awesome stuff along the way. One of the things that is really cool about attack as a framework is that it has this threat intelligence built in, right? And I have a lot of students that kind of start with, well, maybe I'm the security team. I don't have a threat intelligence group, right? If they're trying to approach something like adversary emulation, what are they going to do with what MITRE has already prepared for them with the attack framework?
Okay, yeah. I think, like you said, attack doesn't just have the intelligence built in. It is like intelligence is the foundation of the model. So anything you go to, you view an attack, whether it's like a, clicking on a technique or clicking on a group or an example, definitely consume that. That is based on intelligence. That's going to be, a quick summary of, not perfect intelligence, as obviously things change every day. But, a good, kind of basics and starting point for kind of how to see a particular threat or how to see a particular behavior, particularly the techniques. You're going to get a breakdown of, what this technique, what does it entail? What are the mechanics? Why is it being used by adversaries? You can scroll down the technique page and see like, real examples of, either groups or software that have actually executed this technique. But to your exact question, keep scrolling. At the bottom, we reference everything. So, you might not have the means to get threat intelligence platform or have the time to actually, scrub all open source intelligence. But, we aggregate that, in the sense of, being academic and documenting our work. You scroll down to the bottom there. If you're interested in a particular threat, you can click on that report and you'll see, the CrowdStrike, FireEye, Microsoft, whoever it is, you'll see that report and be able to comb through it yourself. So we kind of hope that, particularly for the CTI use case, that attack is kind of, a cheat sheet, not the end state for all intelligence, but hopefully a good place to, get your bearings, get calibrated to what you care about, and kind of from there proceed and do a deeper dive into whatever particular threats you're interested in.
This is like a living body of knowledge, right? Like how frequently do you update all of the references? Like, are you day to day like, oh, an intelligence report just came out from this vendor today, we're adding it right in right now?
So we release twice a year, but behind the scenes, the elves are working every day. We every day are like, combing new intelligence, getting contributions from the community. People release things and they know, hey, this is representing an attack, or, you previously documented, here's an update to this group or here's this technique. et cetera, et cetera. So, we are, we gear up normally for release in the spring and the fall, but, like to your point, it's not a perfect model. We can't keep up with every single thing that happens, but we do the best we can to kind of stay current with the, not just, mapping to new reports, but also, innovating the model, adding, new tactics as needed, adding new platforms, or however we can grow things to kind of be exactly as I said before. Our goal being kind of, something that resonates with practitioners that they can see and say, oh, this makes sense, or I can use this for, whatever my task is. We do whatever we can to kind of stay current and kind of, not just be this like ivory tower of academic and very scholarly model, but be something that like real defenders can actually like resonate and like, hey, this makes sense to me and I can see how I can apply this to being safer and being better at cybersecurity.
Yeah, it's kind of like maybe a 95% solution, especially for those teams that are like, I don't have the time to do this on my own, right? That's going to get you a large portion of the way there. And all that work of very granularly breaking down all these reports is kind of done for you and built in. So yeah, it's an amazing resource for that. There are some other things that MITRE has done as well to help organizations understand whether their tools are going to actually catch these things, like in the form of the attack evaluations, right? Could you give us a little bit of information about what those are and how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. So attack evaluations is one of my favorite use cases of attack. So what we did was we combined two of my favorite things, attack and adversary emulation, and we run, 2 to 3 day adversary emulation scenarios against vendors. Particularly right now, we're focusing on EDR, but we're also expanding out to ICS and looking into other avenues. But long story short is we run these, these scenarios based on a particular name threat against these vendors. And we do this exactly as we described, this TTP-based approach of, we executed this technique. How did you detect that? How did you protect that? Document all that evidence and then, share it with the community and say, hey, you're interested in these products. Here's how it looks when, an adversary executes this very particular technique. So we started this a couple of years ago with APT3. We did APT29. We just released Carbon-ATT and Fin7. And then going forward, we're actually going to be doing Wizard Spider and I believe Sandworm. Yep. So these adversaries that use like data encryption as, either ransomware or destruction. So we're really excited to kind of, keep the value added is like back to the vendor. These sessions are amazing in terms of, sitting down with these experts who have these like really intricate tools, and we're able to provide them like direct feedback on, this works really well. Oh, this thing that you thought would work, could be improved this particular way. But also sharing that with the community where we see people can actually like go through and, some of these products are, maybe something they haven't touched before. Maybe they have something they haven't seen before. They can actually sit down and like scroll through and say, what happens when an adversary tries to dump credentials in my environment? Like what for this most recent round of evaluations, they can see 29 instances of, credential dumping with an EDR product and like, hey, which one of these kind of fits, my preferences in terms of what I need, but also not just those like, high impact techniques, like looking at like things like discovery or like, execution, lateral movement, wherever you care about detecting adversaries in a kill chain, which, there's a full, we go end to end there. You're able to kind of see each one of those steps and how it kind of, resonates with those vendors.
How do you choose which threat groups to emulate when you go to do those tests? Is it based on how much information you have, or do you try to like dance around the different types of threats, or
yes.
How do you come up with that?
All of the above. So it's a good balance of, as you said, we need the obviously there needs to be a wealth of information, but also needs to be the right information. We can't just emulate based on headlines. We need, specifics about how their malware works, how their operational flow. We need a good base of knowledge to actually build that on. But also we need it to be an adversary that people care about. We can't be something that, some obscure group that no one's heard of. It needs to be a threat that actually people, hey, I actually know who that is. And I have a will to actually defend and kind of know how I stack up against them. But also, as I talked about with like the Wizard Spider and the Sandworm transition, making sure that it kind of keeps up with like, what the industry kind of cares about at the time. So, we've seen ransomware and destructive attacks kind of take over, a lot of headlines. So seeing like what we can do to kind of, fit that same mold and answering those questions on, hey, as defenders and as a community, what can we do about this? So one of the things that we've noticed is like, not only just has evaluations like inform the public about like the detection and protection against, threats, but also like we like to think we push vendors to like, improve, like, between each round, like especially the vendors who participate between each one, we see their products like, changes we made in the previous round kind of cascade to the next round. So we're hoping like, if we're able to evaluate this very dangerous and kind of very relevant threat to these vendors, maybe, something along that process, someone in that room will like have a light bulb will click and they're like, oh, like here's a really good idea. And that will kind of have cascading effects into how these products actually, and maybe they'll document and share with the community and kind of how as a community we can think about defending these products going forward.
Is this something that you found that vendors are like eager to jump into, or do you like just pick a product and they're like, oh no, they picked us?
Oh no. So yeah, we actually don't pick them. They come to us. And like I said, it's a blast. Like you said, we normally do 3 or 4 days of just like back and forth. Like we'll execute our stuff in the morning and then we'll go through like, hey, we have timestamps like, at 9:00 we did initial access and it was these techniques. Here's what it should look like. We love it. It's such a nerd fest because like we're going back and forth and like telling them exactly what we did, the lowest level we can describe it. And they're showing these like dashboards and these like very intricate ways they detect that. And then we talk about, oh, like you could also do this, you could do that. Oh, we have a capability that does that. And it's just back and forth. And so I think, like I said, I always, 80% of like the enjoyment of evaluations is like that process. And like, I feel bad for the rest of the community because like you guys love the results and like, go over it. But we're like, really those back and forth sessions, that purple team, the adversary emulation kind of purple team combo is really like the power of it. And like I said, pushing those products to like, think about, hey, like, not just, I think I've heard you say this in the past, like not just detecting like an adversary stealing your data or, establishing C2, but like everything left of that, everything leading up to that and how we can actually like pinpoint those like detectable points and actually stop a breach before it gets too bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really cool that they come to you with that. I think that shows some maturity and maybe boldness on their part because a lot of companies might be like, oh, we hope it works, right? But they're really, willing to put their product out there and say, let's prove it. And if it doesn't work, then let's fix it, right? So that's definitely a good sign when they're signing up for that sort of thing, all things considered. One of the things you had mentioned previously that I wanted to dip back to was ransomware. We all know that's a big trend right now, human-operated ransomware specifically that's taking over whole companies. Is this something that you've run any evaluations on specifically or any products against? I know that there's probably a lot of listeners out there like primarily worried about ransomware. I get the questions all the time now in class.
Not yet, but that's actually our next big horizon, something we really want to tackle. Was like you said, we're sensitive from both the attack side and the MITRE side. We're sensitive to that issue when we realize how big of a growing threat it is. And really like, I've seen some really interesting, papers and kind of ideas for, addressing it, but just getting something as we talked about, getting something that's more tangible for the average practitioner. It's like, hey, like there's some, theoretical models and some mathematical algorithms that could potentially see like, malware getting ready to encrypt a bunch of files. And there's a couple things you can do kind of in line and kind of prevent how bad it could be. But, to my understanding, a lot of the guidance has been just like, hey, pay the ransom. Like that's probably your best bet. And I think if that's what it is, that's what it is. But let's do everything we can to kind of test things out and figure out, is there a better solution? Is there a way we can, obviously we can stop adversaries getting to that point. But what does that look like? Is there particular things about these, ransomware and, data encryption groups that, are unique about them that we can kind of, trigger on them earlier in that point? Let's make sure we just turn over every stone before we can. But yeah, to your question, we haven't done anything yet, but super excited going forward to, kind of get our beak in the water and kind of see what we can do to kind of push this problem.
Very cool. Yeah, excited to hear you're doing that. From what I read about human-operated ransomware attacks, it's fairly basic. A lot of the time, there's this website called DIFA Report. I don't know if you ever read it, but they have a whole write-up from various real incidents, and it's always like fairly basic, living off the land type stuff. Things that I assume that products will be able to catch and stop. So it'll be interesting to see what the output of that is. One of the things that people might want to do kind of in that vein is maybe run some of these sort of tests for themselves. Is that something you see a lot of security operations centers taking on their own, like crafting and operating these adversary emulation tests?
Yeah. So on our side, we make sure that anytime we do one of these, especially in the public sphere, that we publish it. So we document, and that's the beauty of an adversary emulation is like, in order to do this, like you actually need a lot of, you can't just show up like, morning of and get on keyboard and like do your hackies. You kind of have to do a lot of research, a lot of documentation, making sure like, hey, like we have the intelligence that backs everything we're doing it in the correct way. So, it's pretty easy for us to share those. But yeah, I've worked with a couple of organizations as well who've like, kind of wanted to venture in this space. And, it is a little bit more of an investment because like you said, it's not just, you can't just send, your operators to training and they learn all these cool techniques and they can just come use them. They kind of have to, understand, why, we're making this extra commitment to, all this research. It takes a little bit more like, perspective and skill. You have to maybe bring in some, CTI focused staff, some people who have some, intelligence and kind of analysis background who can kind of provide that light, because sometimes intelligence is an art in itself. It's really tough challenge, but I think it's all worth it in the end state. It's just, you kind of have to, take a step back, realize like, why are we doing this and what all does it take, and kind of bake those extra steps into that timeline. Just saying, hey, ideally we would be doing, the assessment on day 10. We should probably, take that full 10 instead of just starting and like kind of like doing training and stuff up to that point. We should probably take some time to, read some reports, kind of build out, like we call it an op flow. So like, hey, like this is kind of what the operation is going to look like, and not just a basic kill chain, but aligning it with like, hey, like we've researched, APT whatever's like campaigns, and this is what they kind of typically look like, and then filling that op flow saying like, hey, initial access is going to particularly look like this, whether it's a certain payload type or a certain C2 channel, making sure everything kind of aligns there. And then, every adversary has their kind of own cadence. Like, they like to get in, do discovery. They like to get in and like lay low. They like to get in and grab everything they can, and then figure out, just kind of making sure, end of the day, one of the biggest wins we have for like adversary emulation, like obviously red teamers and pen testers are like, we want to pop shells, we want to get domain admin. One of the best feedback we get is from an adversary emulation perspective is like, people who have actually dealt with that group coming to you and being like, wow, that actually felt like, APT-29. Like, I've actually engaged with APT-29 and that looked like it. Or like, hey, like, that Fin 7, like, looks exactly like that. Like or this is a modern version of, Carbon-ATT. Like, we haven't seen Carbon-ATT in a long time, but you guys kind of gave us that same feel. So thank you. Or like, one of the funny things too is like, we'll hit IOC alerts, like, certain strings or certain things. That's not our goal. But, sometimes like a couple of these vendors they'll get like fire some alert and they're like, hey, like we haven't seen this in like a decade. And like, it's because like, obviously you're doing TTPs, but like you hit this domain name or this certain string or this certain combination of things that we've only seen once. And we're like, oh, that's a big win. So thank you.
Yeah, that's really cool. So if you were to set off to do one of these on your own, it sounds like planning is a really important piece of it, right? Like not even just the TTPs, which obviously you do need to collect and kind of plan out per stage, but even the timing of such, right? That's something that maybe people wouldn't, jump to immediately thinking about right off the bat. Is this a smash and grab? Is it a low and slow kind of thing, right? So yeah, when you get to the actual part after you've planned it and you go to start running those tests, based on your experience, what are some of the challenges that you might run into, and what kind of process would you follow during that actual execution of the test stage?
Yep. So yeah, biggest point here is, there's a bunch of sayings in life on this, but nothing goes perfect. You kind of have to, like I said, and we're not trying to be perfect. Adversary simulation is not going to be, a perfect simulation of, every hash value and every, the adversary does 3-minute gaps between this and that. You're just doing the best you can. And, one of the biggest challenges we have is, we're reading about stale intel. We're reading about intelligence that happened previously. So some of those things, might not work. Systems advance, technologies advance, versions change. Some of the stuff just doesn't work. So we kind of think of ourselves as basically, our number one core functionality is telemetry generators. Our job is to put the telemetry into the host so that defenders and tools can detect it. So, you're first and foremost, and make sure get everything on the table, make sure the data's down. But then you kind of have to, flex a little bit of creativity at times. It's like, for example, like, hey, like the PrivEsk that we planned on using doesn't work on the system. But that kind of taps into like the art of adversary simulation. So it's not just like, at that point, obviously everyone wants to like put on the red team hat and say like, oh, well, I heard about something last night, or I read about something last week that would work here. But you also kind of have to think about like, kind of the capability level of the adversary and saying, hey, like, to kind of keep, obviously if we don't have intelligence, we don't have intelligence, but thinking about this adversary, like, what kind of things, based on everything else we've seen, what would they do? Like, how sophisticated are they? Would they like pull out this thing that happened last week? Or would they kind of, pivot to a different box? Would they, kind of, hey, accept their current, privilege level and kind of just do collection and clean up? You kind of have to make those decisions, which is actually really fascinating because it's I don't know, what is it called? Like Stockholm syndrome. After a while, you study an adversary for a while and you're like, you kind of get in their head and you're like, oh, I kind of really understand their operations, like reading about like their history and stuff. I'm like, hey, like they're a criminal group or they're state sponsored. You kind of can get into their head a little bit and say like, hey, like in this case, they would just bail and say this isn't worth it, or they would just make the most of it. And this is kind of looking at everything else they have in their arsenal. Maybe this is why that one campaign, they dropped this malware at this point because they hit the same roadblock or a similar roadblock. So this is all kind of fuzzy. It's not really, it's kind of art, but just kind of keeping things, like I said, at the end of the day is just putting down good telemetry for defenders. So as long as you're not, pulling out a bazooka in a sword fight, I think it's a pretty fair game.
So one of the things you hit on along the way there is some things don't work, right, as you're running the test. When you plan this, like let's say, you look at the kill chain, you come up with 10 options for every stage of the kill chain. You say, these are the things I'm going to test. In a pen test, right, you might get to the point where the pen testers have run into a block and they can't get any further. And maybe that's the end of the test, or maybe it's not. In adversary emulation, let's say you get to the delivery stage and everything is blocked that that adversary is going to do. Do you just say, okay, test over? Or do you try some stuff that maybe they wouldn't try? Or do you just kind of ignore that and say like, all right, this stage was a success, but we're still going to test everything else? Like, how do you approach that piece of it?
Depends. So it depends on the goal. So sometimes we've done like assessments where like initial access was the goal. So like you said, we had our plan, we tried it didn't work. And we're like, hey, let's go through every other thing they've done because, the customer, whoever the defenders are interested in that particular adversary. So let's like go through some options here. But to your point, sometimes you just kind of have to call it quits and say, hey, let's just assume breach this. This part of the engagement wouldn't have worked. That's good to hear. They might have tried something else. We can't emulate that because we don't have the intelligence. Let's just execute that payload in the environment and move on and get to because we're not here just one of the big other assessment kind of things I alluded to earlier was, pen test I typically think of as getting in. Can you get in? Red team is like, can you get in and, how far can you go? For adversary emulation, we're trying to go that TTP mindset. So not just like, one tactic, but getting across all the tactics. So, hey, let's not like spin the mud and waste too much time on initial access. Let's see, let's test some execution stuff. Let's see kind of the spectrum of, as I said before, dropping that data, all the different ways this adversary has executed stuff. Let's make sure all those are being collected and being, actually processed through the full data pipeline. Let's try some lateral movement. So kind of moving on past that. Like I said, that's kind of one of the things is like, especially from the adversary emulation perspective, red teamers, you kind of have to drop your ego and say, be willing to say, hey, you win for this day, you win, let's move on. We're not keeping score here. I just want to, give you as much data and much telemetry as I can. And this is a roadblock. So I think you can chalk that up as a success and see where else kind of this assessment leads us.
Is this one of those things that every time you do a test, you are checking across like all of the tactics and you're going for an end goal? Or do you ever do like a focus, like we're just going to in-depth test the delivery stage for this test?
It all depends. I think one of the biggest things about doing these type of assessments is understanding your customer and actually engaging with them. So saying like, hey, like if you have one assessment a year, probably not a good idea to just focus on one tactic. Let's try to like, balance it out versus like, hey, like if this is a weekly thing, let's actually do a deep dive. And, a couple ways you can do it. You could do a deep dive in each tactic, like you said, and just say like, let's just do lateral movement all afternoon and see what happens. Or there's a lot of value, and we've kind of explored this with evaluations and seeing that end-to-end campaign, saying like, hey, like, and just for the, for the decision makers, but also for the tooling, what happens when an adversary, gets in, immediately sets up a C2 channel and starts moving laterally? Like there might be some, cascading, like, we've seen alerts that are like correlating like this, and this means like extra bad, or like SOC analysts will recognize like, hey, I see a process, like, seeing data points versus seeing like a full graph of like, oh, wow, that whole process tree looks nasty. So, it all depends on, kind of, and that's part of the planning process is like, you build out this adversary emulation plan, you kind of have like, what you want to do and kind of what you want to do in terms of like the mechanics and what data we want to put down. But then you can start like targeting different pieces of it in different ways, depending on, how much time you have, how much resources you have, who's available. Because sometimes, very often you don't want to bother a real SOC. They have real stuff to do. So you kind of have to think about, hey, like, are there certain staff that we can like, use for these days, and what's their specialty? So what do we kind of want to put in front of them versus do we have everyone's attention for 4 days? So let's just do as much as we can, which is going to be that probably more end to end. So it just all depends on, making the most of whatever you have available.
In terms of timing, if you were in control of a SOC that had time, dedication, resources to do adversary emulation, what schedule would you do, this kind of end-to-end testing? Is this like a ideally quarterly thing or otherwise?
It depends. I hate to keep saying that, but it varies because like I said, it depends on the maturity too. Because it's like, from even each round of evaluations, we kind of almost have like a theme for each one. It's like, round one was a lot of process monitoring, and a SOC that's at the level of maturity of just like, hey, being able to see processes and recognize like that's bad, that's good. I understand what that process is doing. You might want to iterate that for a while, and depending on your iteration, the other big thing we do is try not to just hammer a SOC with too much information. So, it depends on how quickly they can, sweep back in and like, make changes, make improvements, make decisions. So I wouldn't recommend any tempo just based on, well, you're not doing it right if you're not doing it like, this many times a year and this often. It all depends on, how mature the SOC is, kind of keeping up with that maturity model. So like say like, we do day 0, we do, a very kind of immature emulation that's just like, hey, can you see net.exe? Do you know what that means? Can you differentiate like CMD and other processes? And if they do that really well, then you're probably at a good stance to say, hey, as soon as possible, let's do a more advanced one that's using like, PowerShell or WMI, something like that. And then maybe it takes them a little longer. It takes them a couple months to kind of follow up on that. And then maybe, you can retest the same thing just to assure like, hey, things, you actually did get a lot better. Things look a lot, more kind of what you expected. So we're able to mature going forward. So that's just as I said before, one of the biggest things in all this is just communication. So making sure, from the red team to the blue team, you're communicating saying, hey, like, how did you guys do? How do you feel about that? So you kind of understand like, hey, like, we obviously need to start working on our next plan, but, should we like, put all hands on deck and make sure we're ready for next week? Or do we have a little while because you guys are going to need to, churn on that a little bit. And maybe we can spend a little bit more time making it a little bit more nuanced because we have, that availability.
How would you say a SOC team that's maybe doing this or looking to do this, how do you measure success in doing adversary emulation, like on a per test basis and on a longer scale, right? Like Jan already mentioned, like look to get better, and more mature over time. But are there specific metrics and, you look at the output of a test and you would say, what are you looking at when you have that information? That's
a hard question we very often get. We see a lot of people, unfortunately, try to buy into this idea that you need to defend and detect like everything in attack, like every technique and every tactic. It's like, that's just not realistic. And I think it all comes down to the best answer I can give you is your expectations. So before you even go into this, just set like, hey, like, this is where we think we should be really good. This is where we, we're maybe a little lacking, and just making sure the output of all that data it kind of aligns with that methodology. Obviously, there's room for improvement. So obviously in the long term, you want to make sure you're improving over time and things that you're buying and things that you're configuring aren't like actually making the environment worse. But just understanding like, hey, like, things like discovery, maybe we didn't make as much of an investment in, execution C2 and lateral movement, maybe places that you invested a little heavier in. This is not me prescribing those, this is just hypothetically. But, maybe just making sure like, hey, like one of the good exercises I would suggest is like going in before anything happens, kind of document, make an attack navigator layer saying, highlighting certain places and saying, this is where I think we're strong, this is where we're weak. And maybe some, brief notes from the engineers saying, hey, exactly why. And then just compare that with the output. Sit down with the red team after and say, you guys did all this stuff. Where do you think you were successful and where you weren't? And then overlay that with the blue team's output saying, where did you see the adversary emulation engagement? We will kind of, build that kind of, sometimes we call it a stoplight chart, like, what things you thought you did really well versus okay versus like, ooh, like see no evil, that didn't go great at all. We don't want to talk about that. And then just kind of compare those two and say, hey, like, are we actually doing as well as we want? Very often than not, we see people are kind of, the expectations align. Like, we have like Splunk or we have like, Sysmons, we're getting good process data, but, oh, wow, like we didn't know that was a huge hole for us. Or, hey, now that we know that we're doing good on these places, the red team did a bunch over here that like we didn't even consider that we thought we needed to care about. But apparently that's a huge part of their operation. Like, discovery being a good example of that. Like, hey, like, how many of our actual like users run like, who am I? Like, that's super weird. Or they do any type of LDAP queries. Like, that's really bizarre. And that's a really easy place to catch them because that's just very unique for our environment. So that constant, like, back and forth of, expectations, reality, and then that playing with that delta, I think would be kind of my advice for both, per engagement, but also like over time.
Very cool. The way that a single SOC might test themselves versus the way that like attack evaluations is run. Like attack evaluations are going at a specific product, but a team, they could do a product-centric evaluation kind of on their own. Would you recommend they do that? Or do you think they should look holistically at like the whole organization, all defenses, will something that we have stop the attackers? And is there value in doing both?
I was going to say my answer to that would definitely be a both because, the individual product thing is going to be a lot better for procurement, but also configuration, understanding like, how do you get the most out of, this particular technology stack, this thing that says and, shows the ability to do this and that, how do we get the most of it? But also, like you said, seeing how that fits into the greater picture and saying, hey, we have Splunk or we have a SIEM that's aggregating all this data. And we have these people that are looking at 3 different dashboards. How do we get the most out of them? How do we put everything that we need in front of their face so they can see, oh, I see like, process data over here, network data over here. And they're able to make that connection and kind of figure out what's going on. So like I said, I think the per SOC and kind of individual adversary emulation is actually one of my more one of my favorites, actually more interesting because you can do that like very specific. Like we do our stuff very agnostic and kind of broad because we don't know who we're getting. It needs to be something that kind of resonates with everyone. But from a per SOC perspective, you can do, particular things that are targeting a particular technology. Like, hey, I'm targeting visibility on, this sensor, and I want to kind of, do a little bounds test, but also throw some intel on it, make sure it's like real. But also you can kind of start looking at, what adversaries you actually emulate and what threats you actually emulate, because, we're picking things that kind of resonate with a broad audience. You can say, hey, like we have credible intelligence that this particular threat is targeting us, and they've been known to use these particular TTPs. But also, like, we can look at our own logs and say, hey, historically, these are the things that have killed us. And these are things that we see kind of knocking at our door. Let's build an emulation around those TTPs to make sure if that door opens, we will see it as soon as possible. And, all these things that we have configured will individually succeed, but also together, like correlate things into a way that hopefully this doesn't escalate into some kind of doomsday dumpster fire within our SOC.
Yeah. In the vein of catching things as soon as possible, if you're running like, let's, quarterly, yearly test or whatever, we all know that anything can break at any given moment. Do you see teams trying to back this up with any kind of automation or tools that will more consistently maybe check these in an atomic sense, or anything that can kind of complement doing a full-on like person-driven adversary emulation?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's one of the beauties of this day and age is like, red teamers and anyone, human capital is very expensive. So we try to, like, very often one of the biggest requests we have is, hey, when we don't have your attention and we don't have like, the resources to kind of bring you in, what can we do on the side? So we've seen a lot of, really great investments in this particular area. I think you even mentioned it, like Atomic Red Team has the, Atomic Red Team framework where you can just like, hey, it's not like a full end-to-end, evaluation or any type of assessment. But if there's a particular TTP that you're interested in, you can just like grab it and just execute it and kind of run like, almost a micro like assessment and saying, hey, like, I'm interested in this one TTP, execute it, or a chain of ETPs, execute those. But one of the things we do is, in terms of documentation and kind of outputs of our adversary emulation, is actually document the plan as well, so that, we can leave behind and say, hey, as hopefully making it as accessible as possible where, obviously, a customer or sponsors like Red Team can execute it themselves. We'll give you like instructions on, how to actually work through that. But also looking at, hopefully a blue team could look at it and say, hey, like, I understand this enough where I could do in the same fashion of that atomic testing, look at this and like copy and paste this command and run it, or, set up, something similar to what the Red Team did. But we also have done a lot of work to porting things to automated tools. So like something like, MITRE's Caldera, where we say, hey, it takes a complete different format, but where possible, let's like take our manual plan with all the commands and all the steps, port that into this like YAML file that Caldera reads in, and those will run in your environment and do everything magically for you and give you that output. It's not, obviously those aren't apples and oranges and for various different reasons, but it's something, like you said, I think, whether it's quarterly or whether it's yearly, defenders aren't just stopping and waiting for these assessments. I mean, obviously they have their real things to worry about, but you can always improve. It's like, we kind of think of it like going to the gym. It's like, you're not just going to run a marathon once a year. You're probably going to do some training and stuff. And very often you might need a sparring partner, whether that's, us or some, magical tool that you just click. Whatever you're doing, it's a net yield of positive. So just keep doing it.
Yeah, you had mentioned, the blue teamers getting access to this sort of thing and making it easy for them to do it. There's kind of been a whole new product category, right? Breach and attack simulation tools that have come up around this. Have you guys? This might get weird and meta. Have you tested the testing tools to see if they're being reflective of the attacks out there? Or has there been any thought about that sort of thing?
We have, actually. It's something that we think about, and we actually engage with those, the Attack IQ and the Safe Breaches of the world. We engage with them pretty regularly, good friends. So something we definitely have in the front of our mind is like, how do we tackle this problem together? Because like you said, there's kind of the two spectrums of these assessments. There's this like human, very manual, very kind of, resource intensive. But then there's also, like you said, there's this automated, like magical, like unicorn, you hit the button and it runs. So like, we're trying to figure out where's the middle ground, because, kind of where people fall in that spectrum is always pretty often somewhere in the middle. So it's like, people want, the depth and the, the accuracy of the human one, but, the ease and the approachability and the accessibility of the automated. So we're still a hard challenge we're trying to, work. But, thankfully we have good friends in the community. We're able to like reach out to, various companies and talk to them. So hopefully we're kind of pushing towards that. But to your point, yeah, we are in cahoots with all the BAS vendors and trying to figure out, what classic MITRE, slogan, but like for the better of the world, like what can we do here and how can we make things easier for everyone?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I think is definitely going to raise the bar and make it more difficult for attackers. Is we're doing this, with people behind it acting, as closely as we can. We have automated tools now continuously testing this stuff, and both of those kind of strike at different portions of what we need. Realism versus continuous testing and all of that. When it comes to the testing and maybe getting back to the human-driven testing portion, when you're going to check a specific tactic or technique, is this something that it's difficult to decide, like the order for specific commands to run? Like, what are some of the difficulties you run into in that regard, and how do you make that as real as possible? Like, do you have like a very granular sense of what an attacker is doing? Like, they run this command and then the next command, and then these data sources pick it up?
And that's part of the art of this. It all comes down to intelligence. Obviously, all intelligence is flawed. It's biased. We're not going to see, like, very often, we very rarely see like, enough detail to actually emulate, everything perfectly. So we kind of have to, consume what we can. Obviously, we can see, like, sometimes we'll see, like, timelines, say they did this and this and this, and we're like, okay, that makes sense. But also sometimes we have to kind of put on our red team hat and say, like, hey, like, I know they executed this, but very likely, and just based on understanding how technology works, they had to do this before, and that means they had to do this before. We can kind of like, we typically kind of call it like the pre and post conditions. Like, for every technique that we want to execute, what needed to happen like before it happened, and then where did that leave you after, and kind of how does that enable to the next step? So you can kind of fill in those gaps. Same thing I mentioned before is, like, you kind of have to also keep like your particular adversary hat and kind of keep them in mind. Like, don't go too far or too like below what they would typically do. And you can kind of almost do like spot like intelligence research based on that. Like, those are some of the best questions we've asked is like, hey, like, how does an APT-29 do discovery? And like, that rather than asking like, hey, similar intelligence with APT-29, those very directed questions, you'll get those very directed answers, which actually kind of, tease out how to build out this plan. But also, to your point, like you said, for everything in an emulation plan, we're not just like, hey, let's execute the TTP for the sake of executing the TTP. Like, hey, they ran like, they have this, very complex malware thing that does all this stuff and has these functions. And, let's just emulate that like to a T. It's more like you kind of have to look at that behavior and say, hey, what is the relevant telemetry or data that comes off the execution of that TTP? And how do we get to that point? I don't really care if we do like a line by line, simulation of the replication of the exact code. I'm more interested in the output. Like, it looks cool. Like the two, like, code bases look exactly the same. Like, that's obviously ideal. But for the sake of reality, it's like, hey, I just need to get to the point where I'm generating the right data for the defender. So it all comes down to, you kind of have to put it through those like very particular filters. But I don't know if we've ever written any of that stuff down, but anyone, this might sound complex and kind of weird, but, it makes sense once you're in the weeds. Like, once you kind of like, you've studied it enough and you're like, pick an adversary and do it for 2 days, and you'll kind of ask yourself like better questions than what I'm talking about right now. So definitely don't think this is some kind of, dark science or dark magic that isn't accessible to anyone who just kind of takes the time to work through it.
Yeah. You wrote a really good series, a 2-part blog post on some of your lessons and things that you picked up from doing these adversary emulations, and the complexity of kind of saying like, well, did this detect it? Could we detect it with enough context? Like if seeing the step before may help, catching stuff later and all that. And in those blog posts, you had one quote that stuck out to me that I think might speak to a mindset thing that's very pervasive through the industry. And the quote was, detecting a behavior is not detecting every technique. You talk about the one-to-many problem. Could you go into a little bit on what that's about and what you were trying to speak to with that very bolded item in that blog post?
I'm glad you picked up on that, because that was like one of my favorite things about that particular entry. So I was hoping people actually like found that. That's awesome. So thanks for the feedback. What I was trying to capture there was, and I think I walked through the example in that actual blog post of like, the way APT-29 previously did credential dumping, it was like super intricate. They built this like, WMI object, they loaded Mimikatz into it, and they like executed all this way. And there's like, I think it ends up mapping to like 6 or 7 techniques. And, that's the way they dump credentials. Do you need to detect every, particular way that an adversary could be attacking that behavior? Probably not, because what we're really, every behavior you do is going to have a choke point. It's going to have, some point that's probably better than the rest to actually detect. In that case, they're still executing Mimikatz. They're still touching LSAS, and all those analytics that we have that kind of, are focusing on that will work. It's just, do you actually, whether or not you detect everything leading up to that with the WMI and all the discovery they did and the deobfuscation and obfuscation of all that code, interesting context. You can hunt that. You can, as long as you're collecting it, you have a chance to defend that. But I wouldn't worry about, kind of the point I was trying to make is exactly as we described earlier, that approach and that kind of, flaw we've seen in the past where people like think they need to write an analytic about every technique in attack versus just kind of understanding like, hey, like, if an adversary is going to do, golden SAML in your environment, detecting that is actually, can be really complex, but there's a lot of prerequisites and things that, that behavior isn't just that one data point. So if you kind of open up your lens and open up your aperture a little bit and kind of think about, not only, your data and what data you're collecting, but also, like I said before, just think about the adversary, think about their behaviors and say, if there's anything they want to do in their environment, there's things that happened before. And part of that I'm better detecting. Like, a good one is, unless you're dealing with fileless malware, a lot of things are going to be dropped to disk. A lot of processes are going to start. Even an immature SOC, that might be their kind of like golden ticket for, finding an adversary. So, same thing we discussed earlier. It's all about thinking about what you're good at, thinking about your expectations, and just making sure that aligns and you're optimizing that for, whatever threat or whatever adversary you're dealing with.
Awesome. Well, that might be a good place to wrap it up. Final question on this. Where is MITRE taking this in the future? Are there any new kind of eval things or features coming up, or what should we keep our eyes out for?
Definitely stay tuned. We're always interested in expanding because, we've had, 3 or 4 rounds of success with, host-based Windows. We've recently expanded out to Linux and as part of that. So kind of touching new domains and seeing, but we also are starting up, ICS evaluations. So seeing a completely new industry, completely new, vendors, different perspective on detecting adversaries. But we're always keeping an ear to kind of the ground and seeing like, where are the problems and where can we address that? So I don't think anything's off the table. We released a blog about, potential mobile evaluations. We've seen a lot of interest in, things like cloud. Previously, we had evaluations on, we included MSSP and MDR services as part of our evaluations. That's another avenue that we think a lot of people actually, how many people like outsource their security to another vendor. So, us being able to evaluate and kind of give you, substantial granular results on, what different vendors look like, how their approach is, kind of give you insight into their practices. We all think that's a win. So I know as much as we like to think that we make these decisions, I also want to open it up to, the community. Definitely reach out and say, hey, this is something, an avenue or an area we've seen that we think would be really interesting. And, there's a substantial need for more information about, network or pick your seams, pick your favorite technology stack. No hard promises, but definitely just wherever industry kind of leads us is kind of where we'll happily follow.
Very cool. So for those who want to dive into this sort of thing, what are the best resources? Where can we find you online? What are we looking to do here? Where can we find it all?
So my second favorite thing about working on attack and attack evaluations is everything's free and globally accessible. So all the outputs are there. So attack, attack.mitre.org, starting point for any and all things attack. But also check out our Twitter. MITRE @MITRE_ATT&CK. That's our main avenue for announcements. Anytime we're making any big changes, we see anything cool, big following there, probably the best stream information about attack. For evaluation specifically, it's going to be attack.evals.mitreingenuity.org. Like I said, we have, not just the most recent rounds of data, but previous rounds. ICS data will be there as well. It's kind of a one-stop shop for anything evals, as well as links to, our emulation plans. We have a couple of good write-ups on our methodology in terms of everything we kind of described today, and like how do we think about adversary emulation? How do we apply it? You'll get some great tips and tricks on setting up an environment, what our environments look like when we do these evaluations. Our goal for those sites were not just everything you would need to kind of consume attack evaluations, but, to make it your own, to understand, looking at the data, why does this matter to me? How can I actually use this data? And if I want to replicate all this stuff with, a tool that wasn't included or my own configuration of the same tool, everything you need to actually get that done. So it's the same offer as before, definitely provide feedback. We're not doing this for us. We're doing this for you. So is there anything we can do to make things better or make things more accessible, more usable, definitely shoot us an email and we'll happily engage and kind of do what we can to improve things.
All right. Awesome. Well, we all appreciate the hard work that you all at MITRE are doing to help us all more accurately test our SOC and get a good idea of what's happening. So hopefully throughout the episode, we've given people a good idea of what adversary emulation is and all the tips and how we can actually implement that in our own organization. So thanks so much, Jamie, for being on the Blueprint podcast.
Thanks for having me, John.
Hey, Blue Teamers. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Blueprint. If you've got a second and want to help support the podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. It would be really, really meaningful to us. And if you have any ideas or suggestions, I would love to hear them. Your reviews are going to be one of the best ways to help others find this podcast. So anything you could do would be a big help. As always, thank you for listening. You can connect to me on social at SecHub, SecHubb on Twitter or on LinkedIn. So until next time, thank you for listening to the Blueprint Podcast.